Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Al Fisher. I will be serving as moderator of today's program, which is entitled, Are We a Death-Denying Society? Thank you for joining us. Nearly 50 years have passed since the psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published her landmark path-breaking book on death and dying. She had found in her extensive interviews with dying patients that many of them were lonely, fearful, and almost desperately eager to have someone to talk to about the fact that they were dying. It was as if I had opened a floodgate, she said. But the patients often felt isolated from their medical caregivers and even their families, who frequently avoided the subject of death. In fact, when Kubler-Ross's work was prominently featured in Life magazine, the medical staff at the hospital in Chicago where she worked ostracized her at first for her alleged indiscretion in making her findings public and often refused to allow her to arrange any more interviews. They reacted with resistance and hostility, she said, and seemed to have a desperate need to deny that death occurred at their hospital at all. We like to think that in this country we have come a long way since then in the ways we talk about death and the ways we treat the dying. Books about death often appear on bestseller lists. Starting in the early 1970s, the number of hospice programs in the United States went from 0 to nearly 6,000 today. And hospice has become very commonly used and very highly regarded. Last year, 1.6 million Americans were under the care of hospice. Laws permitting doctor-assisted dying, or sometimes called physician-assisted suicide, have been passed in half a dozen states, most recently Colorado and California, allowing greater autonomy and choice on the part of patients who are terminally ill. And the study of dying has become a standard part of medical school training. Yet, is this too optimistic and rosy a view? Are there still ways in which we tend to deny the reality of death? For example, why is the average hospice stay today in this country only 17 days rather than the 6 months that are available? Why do 2 in 3 Americans have neither a will nor a living will to tell their family members what their wishes are when they die? Why are terminal patients and their families, often including those with advanced dementia, so often kept alive by artificial means like respirators and feeding tubes? And often in our debates over public policy, we seem to deny the reality of death as well. Remember in 2009, at the beginning of the discussion about what became called Obamacare, a seemingly harmless and very desirable measure that would have provided Medicare reimbursement for patients to consult with their doctors, to discuss with their doctors what kind of advanced directives they wanted, quickly became labeled associated with charges of death panels and, from Senator Chuck Grassley, pulling the plug on grandma. To help us explore these questions, today we welcome to our panel, first, the Reverend Bill Warhover, who is a chaplain for Hospice of Mercy. Second, Dr. Rebecca Benson, Director of the Palliative Care Program at the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Iowa. And Professor David Bullwinkle, Professor of Philosophy at Kirkwood Community College. Let's begin with the question, in what ways is our treatment of the topic of death and of dying persons, in what ways have those changed over the course of the last several decades? And are there ways in which you believe that our treatment of the topic of death and our treatment of dying patients still needs to change. So any of you can feel free to dive in.
Well, I think, Al, thinking about the question, are we a death-defying society? Do we continue to kind of push death away? I thought about my experiences in hospice in 2002 when I was first a hospice chaplain at the Hospice of Dubuque, and went back and looked at some of the statistical numbers from that time to be able to compare to now. And so in 2002, there were about 800,000 people who either died or were discharged in hospice care, compared to today where we have about 1.2 million people who are ending their life in hospice care or being discharged. It's a hard number to track, and those statistics come from the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. But statistically, does the number of deaths in hospice compare to the number of deaths overall? In 2002, during my first stint, there were about 2.2 million people who died overall, 2.4 million, somewhere in there. In 2014, about 2.6 million. And so statistically, we see that people are using hospice more. Anecdotally, what I find is when I'm with people, they're quick to acknowledge death as part of life. Usually it comes out in a conversation when we're talking either about having a sense of fear. No, I knew death was coming at some point, and I've been getting ready for it for years. Or did you think you'd ever live this long? And they said, no, I never thought I would live this long, which also is acknowledgement that death would come at some point. But yet at the same time, death continues to, the end of life for people continues to be a struggle as far as how do we find a sense of meaning in it, and how do we navigate maybe not so much the idea of death itself, but the part of dying. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in your experience, for a patient, going on hospice isn't seen as, in quotes, giving up?
For some people it is. For some people it is kind of a sense of defeat, mm-hmm. or of loss. They are not quite ready. And so it does seem like for them a point in which they say, I've lost the battle, the language, and somehow I'm done. And this is in part, I think, the conversation that is not yet being had is the conversation about how do we find both meaning, and how do we find the narratives to help us to find not only the meaning but the value in the end of life for people.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'd like to pick up there, if I may, because from the healthcare profession, specifically speaking from a doctor's perspective, I think we are a very death-denying and death-defying group of people. We like to push those limits and think that we can save anyone. But I do see that is starting to shift. We use a lot of fighting language in medicine. It's about winning the fight and fighting hard and continuing to persevere through your journey, but I'm trying to help people shift it more towards a journey metaphor, perhaps, or recognizing that when death comes, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've lost. I try to give people other ways of saying they lost their battle to cancer. because I think people win by the way that they've lived their lives. And if they live their lives and what they want to do at the end of their life is to be at home and be supported by family and friends and be comfortable, then hospice is a great route for them. And we should celebrate that. And some people actually live longer in hospice with certain diseases, especially some cancers and heart disease, than they live in the medical system under typical care. So I think we need to recognize that that doesn't mean giving up necessarily, but it means moving on in their life against a battle that we're all in, and nobody's going to win over death. But hopefully by the way we choose to live our lives and the priorities that we make, we will have a sense of that meaning. And I think that one thing the healthcare profession is trying to do a better job of, and we're trying to educate the next generations of healthcare professionals about, is helping patients and families realize as they're making those transitions. Right now, I think standard medical care is about curing and about helping people live as long as possible, and we need to help people transition to living as long as possible, as well as possible, and then living as well as possible when length of time might not be the best thing to be shooting for anymore. So I think that is something that we're becoming more comfortable about talking about in the medical profession, but it's still not as good as it could be, I think. We tend to hesitate to be the ones to bring up the topic, and what we find from studies of this is that patients expect us to be the ones to bring up the topic and to help them realize those transition points rather than waiting for them to bring it up.
You're in pediatrics. Do you think you face significantly different issues regarding death than you would if you were in geriatrics, for example?
Yeah, I think it is very different to think about death in children. And a century ago, it was fairly common for children to die. More recently, that's much less the case. And so illness in children and death in children is fairly rare. It's often centered in the hospital rather than in the home setting. And so it is something that is very isolating for families, I think, and very hard to navigate without strong support from the teams that can help guide them through this process, including chaplains and social workers and nurses that are oftentimes the ones there at the bedside really guiding their discussions.
My impression is that palliative care for dying patients has vastly improved in the past generation or so. Do you think that's an accurate assessment? And do you think there's still substantial room for improvement? For example, I see allegations from time to time that even though the means to provide relief of pain are available, often physicians are reluctant to use them and patients are reluctant to accept them.
Yeah, I think that this is definitely an area that we have improved on, but that has much room for growth. And it is hard for physicians to make these transitions, especially with patients that they know well or have taken care of for a long time. And I think one of the things that I am pretty passionate about is having things like the Concurrent Care Act, which allows children to be in hospice, receiving that multidisciplinary support from a team that understands how to guide a family during that phase of life, but also be receiving the treatment that might normally be available to them. And actually what we find is that that can make for a much more seamless, smoother transition for families, where they're both able to be more comfortable, spend more time at home, but not feel like they had to give up therapies that may have made a difference to them in the end. And they really get the counseling and the benefit from receiving both of those. And in fact, I wish it was available for adults as well, but I'll take it, if we could just leave it for pediatrics, I'd take that for at least a little while. Yeah.
David, you're a philosopher by discipline, and I know that ethics is in your portfolio. Are there significant ethical issues pertaining to death and dying that you would want to discuss? For example, I know physician-assisted suicide or doctor-assisted dying is a bone of considerable contention still, even though about 20% of Americans now live in states where it is legally possible. But it's still very controversial. I think.
Yeah, in my ethics classes, we often talk about the issue of euthanasia, which is slightly different from physician-assisted suicide. And it seems to me that there must be some generational differences, because I find that my students, most of whom are college-age students, younger students, they can't imagine why anyone would refuse to agree to a patient's wish to die in order to avoid suffering if they are terminally ill, and if they are indeed suffering. They think that that is a personal decision, and that no one really has the right to interfere with that decision. The fact that it's only a half dozen states or so that have legalized this practice does make it seem as though my students are not the norm in what they believe is not what most people believe. So, I mean, it might just be something about the fact that they're 20 years old, and they may not have really thought about death much in terms of their own lives. They may still feel like they're going to live forever, although a lot of them have personal stories from their families to share about grandparents or parents or siblings or other folks that they know and love who have gone through terrible illnesses and suffered terribly, and either want to make that kind of a decision or do make that kind of a decision. So sure, it's a very familiar topic in the ethical context. Yes, yes. I wondered, though, if we could expand the scope of our conversation. Mostly we've been talking about the culture of dying within the medical setting, right? Either in a hospice or in a hospital. But the death is a subject that cultures in a broader sense have always had to deal with, right? Birth, marriage, coming of age, marriage, death. These are perennial topics for ethical, for cultural teaching, for ritualization, and so on. I guess I just wonder what you all would say about American attitudes towards death more broadly, even outside. Like, what attitudes do patients bring to the table when they are diagnosed with a terminal illness? What informs those attitudes for people who become patients? Right, it's not only well, I think I've made my question clear. So what do you think?
Well, I think in part, David, is what I see anecdotally in hospice care is in part it depends on a person's experience with death and dying. While we see many people embrace the journey or this part of life as normal or natural part of life, we also see more of those from the outside continue to kind of push back. And so sometimes we see family come close, sometimes we see family withdraw. And I think a lot of it has to do with whether there have been conversations or other experiences that have been positive. And I really don't know culturally that we have a lot of good positive narratives or stories about death that are that embrace the value in that time of life. We see death as a loss to be avoided, as a defeat to be mourned, but we don't see the intimacy that happens. We don't see the kinds of relationships that go to new places. Movies, television give us images of tragic death, violent death, but I don't think we see good death often. So I think culturally we're caught in between. Even as I hear you say, for your students, they can't understand why somebody wouldn't want to or wouldn't want to agree to somebody's wish to die. And I think in part that wish comes from suffering with no meaning. We can't see the meaning in this period of life. And I just think it's so deep and rich if people can come close to it. And for me, as a hospice chaplain, that's how we're trying to help people to find life.
That's very interesting. Well, do you want to keep going? I
Going
have a
back
question,
to your
but
point about
I can come back to it.
generational differences in attitudes toward death. I'm a Vietnam era veteran, though not a Vietnam veteran, but I've taken a very strong interest in the ways in which the Vietnam War and the people who fought in it are portrayed today. And I've been struck, particularly from knowing quite a few World War II veterans intimately through my church, that they have had a much more difficult time talking about their experiences than Vietnam veterans have. And my first visit to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial I thought was a very moving one because it sounds a bit macabre, and yet I found it to be a place where people come in part to commune with the dead. So the thing that struck me as I worked my way along the 692 feet length of the monument was the silence. I could only hear the shifting feet in the slag and maybe some people weeping. And apparently the National Park Service collects large numbers of artifacts that people leave at the wall. For example, several years ago on Father's Day, a ranger found a double brass picture frame. On one side were two blurry sonogram images. On the other side, a handwritten note saying, "Dear Dad, here are the first images of your first grandchild. He will come to grow and know you just as I have, even though when I last saw you, I was just 4 months old." So I think I find it very interesting to look at attitudes towards death through attitudes toward particular wars and the fatalities that they brought about. So if you were the Surgeon General, what kind of proposals or suggestions for change might you suggest in the American healthcare system, or if you were a cultural czar, what kind of cultural changes would you like to see in attitudes toward death? We've talked about what I think all four of us see as some rather positive changes that have occurred in the last half century.
Yeah, I think we need to shift a focus to living well and dying well rather than trying to push death off until the last possible moment and spending lots of money and burden and suffering in that time of being in intensive care and being separated from family. I think that's really where the weight of it comes for me. And so the conversation needs to start much, much earlier so that we can really feel what people's goals are as their illness changes, as their experience with other family members changes, so that we really can help people to find meaning in what their life and their death are going to mean for who they were and what they were able to leave for those behind them. So I think moving that conversation earlier, bringing it out into the mainstream, and then making sure that it's actually happening where it needs to happen within the medical system are the things that I would like to see happen.
I think as we are able to rethink death, not death, dying. The story of dying, as the narrative begins to change, as it becomes positive, some of the anxiety dissipates, and some of the medical kind of anxiousness that we're reaching for anything we can, and in doing so, we give away part of who we are. I think it takes care of itself to an extent. That when we're no longer anxious about it, we can make better decisions for ourselves and our loved ones that make better sense medically as well. So I'm not sure about changes to the medical system at this point, but I think the cultural narrative can change.
It's occurring to me that in the past, people had religious metaphors that helped them make sense of the process of dying, right? I'm going to meet my maker, which I'm going home. These gave people a positive frame with which to think about the process of dying and the result of dying. I wonder if those metaphors have lost some of their power as the national dedication to religion of any kind has weakened, just as a sociological fact. I think that's happened. The number of people who are able to tap into those metaphors or those metaphors is also reduced, but that leaves a lot of us who are still facing the prospect of death, and yet we don't have ready metaphors at hand to draw on. So I wonder, it's a kind of a challenge for cultural workers, for writers, for filmmakers, for the authors of children's books to give us new ways of thinking about this process and what its end result is and what its meaning is. Right? I think that is a project for the larger culture and not just for the medical community. I mean, I think the medical community would benefit and would be
Certainly.
Glad to inherit the effects of that cultural shift. But it really does mean that writers and readers both need to be willing to confront death and suffering. I was so interested by what you said before about the meaning of suffering, right? So if someone is terminally ill, the odds are they're going to die, let's say, in 3 months' time, and their condition is causing them to suffer a great deal. How do you think about, Bill, I'm asking you just because this was your idea, how do you think about the meaning of that suffering?
I think it is suffering with a cause, with a purpose. That it's not suffering for its own sake. And again, how we define suffering, we might want to talk about, or that's another part of the discussion. But it's almost that kind of conversation about redemptive suffering that we give of ourselves in order to to change a heart or to transform a relationship. It's the kind of suffering that we hear about in the civil rights era, this redemptive suffering for another's sake. And in part what I think is that that kind of sharing of an experience brings us to a very different place relationally.
So even though the suffering is not part of a healing process, it can still bring about some good, you say?
Well, it can be about a different kind of healing.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. David, Becky, Bill, thank you very much for your most interesting contributions. Thank you for joining us today on Ethical Perspectives in the News.